My guest today is Circe. She is a pseudonymous author, an advice columnist for The Blaze, and an extraordinarily fun Twitter poster at Vocal Cry on Twitter. Today we speak about dating, but also about Slavic insight into dating, about cope as a fuel for most of online discourse, about the question, are men and women refusing to get married and destroying the West? We're also talking about birth rate decline and birth rate decline discourse, two very separate things. About the fact that prominent MRAs are women, about Repeal the 19th, and all sorts of fun tidbits about our paths through the right and through dating discourse. This is a really fun episode. The full version of it is on my Substack at alexkashuta.com, or if you just want to listen to the audio and are uninterested in the full archive of my writing and every other episode that has ever been on this podcast, please do just go to patreon.com/aksubversive. Enjoy. There seems to be something interesting, spicy, insightful about the perspectives of the Slavic in terms of dating and relationships, and I wonder what do you think that is? Like, what's the animating principle of number one, so many Slavs opining on dating and relationships, two, them being genuinely insightful, present company included, and what gives us the soul resources to be able to convey wisdom at that level.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something maybe ancestral in having come from a people that have gone through quite a bit, and I think Slavic people, even I'm a first generation immigrant to the U.S., but I was born in Ukraine, and I feel like I have a lot of that kind of old world mentality. I think you just take a more realistic and pragmatic look at things, and a lot of Americans tend to, especially when it comes to dating, have this very kind of pie in the sky, overly romantic notion that mostly comes from, I think, Hollywood and rom-coms and all of those kinds of things. And they're not really, when dating, they're not thinking, what kind of life am I going to build with this person? What are the practical implications that go into that? What is this person going to be like in a catastrophe? Let's say you're living through a governmental political upheaval. What is that going to look like? I think most people are thinking, oh, is he cute? Does he have a cool job? Is he fun? Which all of those are great things, but very few people, I think, are thinking long terms in terms of character. And myself, and I think people that have kind of had upbringings that I've had with Slavic parents that have been through a lot and have seen how important it is to have a partnership that can withstand all kinds of chaotic times. I think we tend to place greater priority on elements like character, especially in a man. Well, I myself date men, but I think Slavic men tend to look for those elements in women as well.
Yeah, I think that's what I found as well. I mean, it's been interesting dating Westerners. I mean, my husband is kind of an Anglo type. I've been looking for this type actually. I've been known to complain a little bit about not necessarily like some deep character flaws of the men here, but to be honest, if you're looking for like a very kind of invested father, like hands-on type, it is a bit slim pickings here. There are quite a few and more. Obviously, I think maybe the growth rate of involved fatherhood is higher in Eastern Europe just because it started close to zero. But yeah, there's more of these types of millennial fathers who stepped up to actually parent their kids. But yeah, I mean, my husband's seen a bit as like this miracle figure here. The fact that he goes on walks with our toddler and the baby, and people are looking at him like traffic stops, like, oh my God, is he okay? What's going on? Is this a psychotic episode? Yeah, he's just he's pretty much as involved as I am, and it's quite I know, refreshing, especially for me, because yeah, it's quite useful. So yeah, this is quite a big difference that I've seen between yeah, Eastern Europe, as it is today, and Western Europe, and it was a big factor for me, I think, just even looking back.
Yeah, I can't speak to kind of, the generation of Slavic men living in the Eastern Bloc, the former Eastern Bloc today. I can obviously only speak to kind of, my own father, who I'm very close to and was very involved in my upbringing, and the fathers of my friends who had also immigrated, and they have very similar relationships. So I don't know if it was just a different generation then, so I can't comment on that. But I do think there is something to be said for the Slavic woman, Western kind of American or Anglo man pairing, because I do think Slavs, when left to their own devices, are a bit too cynical, and Americans and maybe to some extent Western Europeans are maybe a little overly um, rosy in their disposition. So I think, if I had my way, Russians and Slavs in general could use a dose of American optimism, but Americans could definitely use a dose of Russian cynicism. So I think that pairing kind of goes together nicely.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting though when you bring a Westerner to a place like Romania. Um, when my husband, he's from New Zealand, so the first time he came here, he was just walking down the street saying hello to everyone, which was quite startling to people. It's just you just don't do
Yeah.
that. Do you want to scam me? Is this a is
What's
this
your
a
angle?
pick 'em up? Yeah, exactly. What's your
Yeah.
angle? So it was really sweet, and I was like, "Oh, this is kind of you to say hello to people, but I think you're gonna get unused to this habit just because it's yeah, it's incongruent to the local norms." Which is interesting because I think what shocked him quite a lot was how warm and how hospitality is a big virtue of Romanian culture, but you just kind of have to get a little bit closer. Like people wouldn't be like extra friendly to people on the street. That kind of leaves you open to predation, which you don't want. But
Yeah,
once you're like
absolutely.
in the inner circle, it's all cool. But that difference between private and public seems to be like a little bit hard to process for people who've just not grown up in it. There's more like, I guess it's just a difference between a high trust and medium to low trust culture.
Yeah, and I think the opposite is true. When I remember when I first immigrated to the States, I was very put off by what I thought was kind of performative niceness, and
Mhm.
I've come to kind of appreciate it when you live abroad and you go into a store and everybody's kind of just like, what do you want? It's nice to come home and have like this fake smiling cashier. Like, oh, how are you? But it is a little jarring when you go from one culture to the other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, your now not necessarily your day job, but your partial job is now as a columnist and advice columnist for the Blaze, and you've been giving opinions, I guess, on pretty much anything, but also a lot of dating because that seems to be like the core preoccupation of everyone at the moment on the internet, at least whatever the algorithm. This is what it serves me, and it's quite deranging. I wonder how much do you think dating discourse is just people trying to cope with their own decisions, all sorts of path dependencies that they've put themselves on, and just just kind of making a sort of cult out of their own situation.
Yeah, I would say definitely more than half. And if I'm feeling particularly cynical that day, I'd say up to 90%. I mean, I think a non-trivial people are using social media and in particular Twitter, which has a large number of anon accounts to portray this sort of fantastical version of themselves that is completely unaligned with reality. And a lot of these kind of masculine alpha dating advice accounts, for example, have been shown to be run by women on the subcontinent. And of course, it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy when some of these people, they've made their romantic misfortunes or their ill-advised choices kind of part of their online identity, and I think they just continue to act in a way to uphold that identity. So taking for example the incel accounts, um, that's always a hot topic, but these are people that have thrown their lot in with a group that is considered undesirable to women, whether that is actually true or not. But they end up looking for confirmation that they are in fact undesirable. And of course, that has the effect of actually making them undesirable. So I think we see a lot of pathologies on display that are masquerading as kind of esoteric knowledge of romantic arts. And, I do think there are, of course, some very few well-adjusted people, as well-adjusted as people on Twitter can be. And those are people that have usually kind of have some life experience, have some real world observations to contribute to discourse and to serve as kind of a counter to this otherwise chaotic area. But a lot of that wisdom, I think, tends to fall on deaf ears. I tend to think of the Twitter dating discourse. It's almost like Plato's allegory of the cave. Everybody's sitting around, they're in chains, they're kind of observing the shadows of the wall on the walls, of what they think kind of the romantic sphere is like. They've never been outside of the cave themselves. They're just kind of describing distortions that they've maybe read about or theorized about. And if one of these people actually manages to break away and go out into the real world, they discover that kind of what they were seeing on the walls were kind of maybe at worst completely false, and at best maybe half truths. And say they go back and try to like explain it to the people there and about what the real world is like, and they don't want to hear it. Those people would rather kill you than kind of drag you out, have you drag them out of the safety of their cave. And I think that's how it is.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about kind of keeping that coherence between the persona that you build up and all the kind of relationships that you build with that persona, and kind of the groups that you infiltrate. It kind of becomes like a little family online, and I think the
Yeah,
incels are kind of like this tip of the spear for that. It's like you make your whole personality the fact that you can't get laid, you can't get a relationship, then it's destroying your social life, and this community that you've built if you actually manage to overcome this horrendous situation. So it's weird, but I think a lot of people, like myself included, are in some small or big way kind of enslaved to that coherence that you're trying to maintain. I mean, I have like an audience to maintain. They expect a certain type of
sure.
thing from me, a certain type of wisdom, the well trodden path usually. So it is interesting, and you know, I guess you kind of have to find a middle ground between yeah, having epiphanies in public and and maintaining your audience.
Yeah, audience capture I think is definitely real for quite large accounts. That I don't have that big of a following, so I don't know what it would look like if I did. But you see this definitely in accounts. I'm not gonna We don't have to dwell on like Pearl, for example, but just people get popular for saying kind of crazy things, and then they kind of lock themselves into that mode.
Yeah, I think it's you know, in a way, for, I guess for Pearl, it's quite a good business model. I don't know how cynical she is. I guess you can't be that cynical. You kind of have to buy into it, or at least she did buy into it at some point. And now, I mean, it's a little bit too big to
I mean, I
walk
have
it
her
back.
blocked, but
Oh,
yeah,
really? I
she's
mean,
definitely,
I
it's
have
a
her
great
muted.
business.
Yeah, I'm
There,
halfway there, but yeah.
yeah, I got to the point where I was just every time she tweet, I would start quote tweeting her, and then one of my friends was like, "You have to stop." I was like, "You're right."
Yeah, you're feeding
So,
the beast.
yeah, I try to not feed the trolls to the extent that I can, though of course it's very tempting too.
It's tough, and I mean that's kind of what she wants. That's her business model. She wants you to, you're like a relatively big account yourself, and you feed it, and then you're following. There's so many like little like whirlpools that form at the edges of this, and then she essentially just gets this huge boost. And yeah, I guess the machine is fed for another day. Yeah, I don't know. I've had a bit of a sobering phase in the last. I mean, probably the last few months, but probably maybe more than a year, maybe two. To be almost shortly after I joined the internet, I kind of saw these cycles forming. I saw kind of how discourse was formed and how people reacting, the reaction to the reaction to all of this, and then at one point it just gets really repetitive, and you kind of see how hollow it rings. I mean, I don't want to be like a doomer, like, oh, I've seen the seedy underbelly of all this bullshit, but it's this is apparently how I make some money, and how I feed my family, so I have to you know be interesting online. But at one point, you kind of, I don't know, it gets a bit. At least I was a bit conflicted about, okay, how I know how to play the game. Do I want to play the game? Once you know how to play the game, it's like, ooh, it feels a bit weird to be playing this game because I don't know. It's I don't know. I don't know if this makes any sense, but yeah, I think you kind of see where I'm going with this. But yeah, it's
No,
it's
it
it's a weird
definitely,
one.
it is a game. It's absolutely a game. And I think if you are kind of aware of that dynamic, I think it's fairly harmless for people who don't really consider Twitter to be real life or to have a life outside of, the internet. But I do see it having an effect on especially a younger audience, many of whom do, I think, internalize this discourse. And I've been getting quite a few questions for my column from young women who are consuming this content, especially kind of the red pill content, and they're thinking, okay, well, if these are the expectations that men have of me to be, this beautiful expert homemaker of, wonderful character and have all these great positive qualities, and the best I can hope for is, a man who um, thinks he should have a harem and shouldn't really care about what I think outside of just having me as a wife. Like, what is the point of that? And is that really what a relationship is? So I do think it is important for those counter voices to kind of set the record straight, because if you're like an 18-year-old or however old some of these people are on the internet and you don't really have life experience, I think it's very easy to kind of become black pilled very quickly.
Yeah, I see there's quite a few movements. Like, I don't know, I think like South Korea always, yeah, tip of the spear again. They've got the 4B movement. There's all sorts of kind of like female MGTOW type things, women going their own
Yeah,
way. I mean, I don't know, as someone maybe close to the pulse here of people asking you questions, do you think this is like a potential bigger trend, like women retreating from the mating market because it's all just frightening, tedious?
it's hard to say honestly, and I don't really think it's true that it's just women retreating. I think in general there is a trend of both men and women kind of opting out of dating, and I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One, I think there's just less of a stigma around being single today. You know, in the past, obviously there were very strong social incentives to marry and have children, and people definitely thought there was something wrong with you if you weren't married. It was just a basic form of social proof. Like in the 1950s, if you weren't married, didn't have a family, you were definitely considered lacking in some way, especially in the workplace. And I think the stigma definitely affected women more than men at a younger age, but it definitely applied to everybody. And even as far back as ancient Greece, you know, bachelors were compelled to marry under threat of having their citizenship revoked in places like Sparta. And I think celibacy was illegal in some other city states. So I think nowadays that just doesn't exist anymore. I think single people, probably thanks to kind of the sexual revolution and the boomer divorce rates, I think single people now mostly enjoy the same privileges as married people. So there isn't just that social pressure to just find somebody and settle down. But I also think that just there are a lot of economic factors that are preventing people from starting a family. I think, yes, on the online trad right, they're saying you absolutely can support a family on one salary and you can make it happen if you just sacrifice this and that. And that may very well be true, but I don't think the average person thinks it's feasible. And between like crippling debt from student loans and rising costs of housing and childcare and food, I just think most people feel like they can't afford children, or they definitely have to have both parents working, which I think for women is a worse deal than for men, because they're expected to, you know, be a mom 100% of the time and an employee 100% of the time, which I think is very difficult.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think the bigger problem here is yeah, I mean the idea that this is something that applies across the board. I think that the biggest problem with birth rates, family formation, all of this stuff is in the middle class. So these are people who
Yep.
obviously would see a big hit not only to their standard of living if they were to have kids, but also to their class position, because the so-called lower classes, underclass, never really had a problem with high fertility because a lot of
Hmm.
oopsies happen. No, not that much conscientiousness and all of that. But in the middle class, where everything is planned out, seeing your social status falling potentially to lower class status is something that you want to consider. I mean, you've gotten used to having a car, living in a decent neighborhood, sending your kids to non-stabby schools. All of all of these things seem to be like normal, seem to be like the baseline. If you grew up in the stabby neighborhood, it is what it is. But if you go from one balanced situation to an unbalanced one, then that's kind of scary, and I understand why people don't really want to make the jump. And I think a lot of these online ideologies address themselves to kind of these middle class people who are adrift, who don't really have a because the so-called underclass also either tends to be a little bit more religious, or they have something to preoccupy them, maybe a little bit. They're not on Twitter fighting out the trad wars or whatever. They're doing other stuff, fighting real life, in one way or another.
Working.
But yeah, working. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Something, a little bit more hands-on than an email job or something. But yeah, it's all, some way for the middle class to find purpose, to find something to do with their lives, to see how, to see if it's even possible to live a life comparable to their parents. And it increasingly seems like it's not really possible, at least not within the same parameters. You know, there are all sorts of kind of economic arguments that say that, oh, in a way, this is never, it's the richest generation. But I think, like you said, comparatively, in terms of the things that actually matter for family formation, like for children and everything, schools, property, I guess even fuel, it's getting much tougher than it used to be.
Yeah. I agree. And I think that on some level, people now find, you know, aside from the economic constraints, people are just thinking companionship is almost optional. I think, before the internet, if you lived alone in a small town and you didn't have a family, you didn't have kids, like there wasn't much to do in the evenings. And now between, social media and porn, people can just participate in this kind of simulacrum of companionship, which is not exactly the real thing, but it satiates that need enough where they don't feel like they need to go out and actively look for someone. And I think, the coming AI companions are only going to exacerbate this for both men and women. And if we want to see where it's headed, we can honestly just look to Japan, where I think something like a quarter of adults under 40 are virgins. So I can only see that trend in the US continuing that direction.
Oh man, that's I mean, I
Sleek.
guess it is very bleak, exactly. That's the first word that came to mind. Yeah, I mean, it seems like it. I do believe that there's always going to be, a very horny fraction of the population who will reseed the earth. Especially in Europe, East Europe,
Oh,
even Western
I'm
South,
sure.
Southern
Yeah.
Europe. Oh yeah, Southern Europe will repopulate the earth for sure. But yeah, it's also there are some, I think, differences culturally, genetically, I have to say on this show, that that makes, I think, East Asia a little bit more susceptible to trends like this. But yeah, I think no one is accepted from the kind of the violent course of history at this point. I
Yeah, I mean, I do think you're right in that, but it does seem to be going in the direction where more people are just opting out of the dating scene that's supposed to be leading to marriage. And I think another kind of factor that's worth considering is that people's expectations for what a relationship is or what a marriage is are just kind of so out of line with reality. And I don't know if it's, social media that's driving this, or porn for, for men. But I do think that there a lot of the dating kind of issues can be um, distilled into people having like champagne taste on a beer budget. Essentially, they're
mm,
expecting something that they can't reasonably command in the dating market. And whether for women it's like a 7 foot tall billionaire who also has the emotional intelligence of a woman, and for men it's like a 10 out of 10 bikini model who goes to church every Sunday and will live with him in a shack. Like, it's just on both sides you kind of see these growing expectations that are just far from what the real world looks like.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I'm like any woman in her 30s with children. I spend a lot of time on Instagram because I'm breastfeeding. I have to look at something, so I look at these ostensibly like middle class women on Instagram. Like I almost spent like a fortune redoing my house in like a whatever river cottage style because that's kind of what I've been bombarded with on Instagram. But you know these are like this is not middle class like this the amount of spending they do, especially kind of when you get into the mommy tier. You have the playroom, there's a whole space, extra space for children. Every child has their own room. This is, I mean, just thinking about it, just the napkin calculation would tell you that these people have to have like an income about like at least $500,000 a year, just given the restoration hardware,
Hmm.
whatever couch that they have, and all this type of stuff. Like you kind of know, maybe they have this, this is social media income, and this is trying to sell this stuff, probably also part of it. But I think a lot of people are just they haven't calibrated what it actually means to be having an average income, kind of there's no representation for what the actual mathematical average looks like. The internet average is pretty much rich people. And we also have extreme exposure to people who are billionaires, like, you know, back in the day before extreme exposure to anything, there's the concept of, millionaire, billionaire, whatever, was a very airy fairy. They were out there at the Ritz with their, monocles and twisting their mustaches and smoking cigars and all this type of stuff, very abstract type of characters. But now they're out there, dating, I don't know, anchors, TV anchors, or whatever they're doing, and acting out in the world, imposing their will. So it's a very strange new world. The idea that Joe Schmo knows the details of Jeff Bezos' life, and the details of his divorce, and identifies with Jeff Bezos' divorce as well, which I think is quite interesting. Yeah, it's definitely a new world.
Yeah, I think so I've never been on Instagram. I think partially for this reason, like I just
Good for you.
I don't, besides Twitter, like I haven't really been a social media person. I got rid of Facebook like a long, long, long time ago and never did Instagram. Was briefly on TikTok during COVID, out of curiosity. But I really hated just being bombarded with like images of people who I vaguely know and like what they're doing, and I don't care. I don't want you to know what I'm doing, and so I kind of avoided that whole thing. But I could see how potentially psychologically damaging it is for people who are not commanding like a huge salary. They're probably like scraping by to make ends meet, and they're constantly being bombarded with these fabulous houses and these fabulous vacations. And I think, like you said, maybe in the past the average person would, whether they were a peasant in the Middle Ages or just kind of like a factory worker in the industrial era, they wouldn't have a ton of exposure to how the better half lives. Like maybe they'd walk down the nice area once in a while, but they weren't constantly like seeing the inner workings of these people's lives, which I mean, I could see how that would drive a lot of kind of resentment and dissatisfaction.
Yeah, and also I think, we were talking about the birth rate before. Like, I think this comparison in itself, the idea of what an actual good lifestyle would look like, what do you want to offer your children? Like, if you're someone who's, trying to conceive or expecting or something, you're probably watching all sorts of content that's aimed at children and moms and stuff like that. Like this whole like extremely aspirational lifestyle, the Montessori toys and all this type of, making it match with your interior decor and the schools, and the preparation and the courses, and it's also like parenthesis, this high involvement parenting, I think, is not good for children at all. I mean, maybe this is just me trying to trying to opt out, but I don't really see any difference between me being like extra Montessori and extra, applying all sorts of special techniques, or just being a bit more chill with my toddler. I mean, he's got a mind of his own. There's not really much guiding him. I can offer him things to do, and little sensory bins and all sorts of stuff that just messes up my whole house. Or I can just kind of let him roam in the garden and dig, and the stuff that he actually wants to do, and surprisingly the result is the same. He's not more agitated, he doesn't learn faster. It is what it is. So I think I've kind of divested my stock in mommy influencer content in general. So, but I think I can see how one would be influenced by what the expectations are, and I wonder. I mean, if you were czar of birth rates for 10 years, is there anything that you think would actually work to fix birth rates? Like what thing, what campaign, what influence, what policy, what UBI, what would you think would actually work?
Yeah, so this birth rate question is very tricky. And to be totally honest, I don't know where I stand on it day to day. I think, on the one hand of the spectrum, you have Elon Musk, who has been sounding the horn about a population collapse and of course, to give the birth rate doomers their due, we can see what a declining birth rate society looks like. If, once again, to cite Japan as an example, you'll have an aging population that's a burden onto the younger population, and fewer people being productive, paying taxes, etc. So there are obviously a lot of issues. But, on the other hand, we have Bill Gates, who has been villainized for his desire to flatline population growth. And, if you followed some of the more conspiratorial channels, to decrease the population by nefarious means. And, to the point, like, do we really need more biomass? And if we do, and if that's just what it is, like, what is the ideal amount of biomass? Is it another 8 billion? Is it 2 billion? I don't know. But I think, look, a lot of what goes unsaid in this birth rate discussion is where we're trying to actually increase the birth rates is in the first world. It's not the third world that's suffering from declining birth rates. And I think just by virtue of being industrialized nations with higher living standards, higher education standards, you just tend to see a correlation in a declining birth rates. And I think kind of what happens when you move from that kind of poor developing nation status to a wealthier one is you go from an R kind of reproductive strategy where you're having more offspring and investing fewer resources into them, to a K reproductive strategy where you have fewer offspring that you're pouring more resources into. And I think there is just like a bit of a paradox that can't be resolved without us kind of turning back into the third world. I think the Mormons are really the only population in America that are kind of pulling their weight with regard to birth rates. And that is it's a very specific kind of culture. And for us to adopt that on a mass scale, I think would take something close to a, religious reemergence, strong religious reemergence in the US, because I think a lot of what drives the Mormon kind of procreative imperative is their religion, where you want to have as many kids as possible because you want to be closer to God, who has a lot of children, and you're preparing to kind of have your own universe in the afterlife, and you're kind of learning to run that universe by having lots of children. So there's this whole theological kind of backbone that supports that, but without some very compelling narrative, I just don't see that turning around in the West anytime soon.
Yeah, I think even the Mormons, I mean, I haven't checked this year, but I think it was last year that even like Salt Lake fell under like replacement, and I
Oh,
think only
really?
the Amish are still well, and Orthodox Jewish communities and stuff, but very very few. Like where this whole replacement fertility is being pushed into the edges, and even the Amish are seeing decline. Not they're still doing pretty well, but still it's not no one's growing. That's the thing. No one's having more children than last year. It's all is kind of slowly eroding into that, like you said, first world problem situation. But yeah, I think that's kind of what I hear as well, like as kind of a threat. Women better start having children, or, better start putting out, or indoor plumbing is going away, Mad Max situations, and then you'll see how bad it can be when you can't open your own jars, and when you're dependent again on the menfolk to for your basic survival. I mean, I'm not saying that that's not possible. I don't necessarily think it's probable to happen anytime in any sort of foreseeable situation. Depends, who you talk to. There's a lot of people like, I think so John Michael Greer or something, like, peak oil people, and who say, okay, the actual end is nigh, energetic crisis, things like that, an EMP. the Road, Cormac McCarthy type scenarios. Yeah, could be, but yeah, I don't. I'm not gonna necessarily plan for that.
Yeah, I think
So I
more
mean,
likely, sorry, go ahead.
no, no, continue.
I think the more likely scenario is not so much the Mad Max way. I mean, who knows? Crazy things happen. But I think it's the unchecked migration from the places with high birth rates that is really kind of going to be the point of tension, which it already is. I think. I mean, obviously, if the foreign population that is moving into your lands unchecked is growing at a faster pace, eventually, the local population will become a minority. And I think that's kind of the concern of a lot of European countries and obviously in the US as well. But it'll be more of a replacement situation, I think, and less of a societal collapse. And you can argue one will lead to the other, but that's a different discussion.
Yeah, I think so too. I think my expectation there is, I mean, if you look at actually what's happening, what tends to happen is fertility drops after the first generation, pretty much to, the level of the local population.
Yeah.
Is this still going to happen if the so-called local Western population is in a minority? Maybe yes, maybe no. This is essentially the pattern that's happened up to this point. Then there's a case of pre end of apartheid South Africa. There's like you don't really need like a huge fraction of people to have a relatively functional society, even as a minority. I mean, whatever you want to take out of this, but it is possible. Not saying that this
Sure.
is what's going to happen, but
Yeah.
this is a historical scenario that has existed. I mean, obviously, historical constraints have stepped in. Things have changed. South Africa isn't what it used to be in many ways, for the better or for the worse as well. Um, you know, things. Yeah, history takes its course, but um, it is pretty hard to interpret. Yeah, just the idea that okay, there's a lot of people flooding in, and also I think I don't know this the discourse on birth rates is a bit iffy as well. I think a lot of people a lot of the incels have opinions on the birth rate, and they're very concerned about the birth rate. A lot of
Oh,
people
yes.
who can't get a date, are temporarily embarrassed patriarchs who would have a extremely successful
Absolutely.
family life, 10 kids, if they could just contribute to the birth rate. They're being stopped from
Yeah.
contributing to the birth rate.
I almost
So
think it's become like a signaling mechanism on this part of the right. It's you'll meet somebody, and I've met so many of people like this in real life, and the first thing they'll say is, "Okay, well, I want to have 10 kids, and I want to build a dynasty." And I'm like, "Well, you're, you know, 28 or 34, and you don't have your own place, and I don't really know if you have something resembling a job. Like, how are you going to support these 10 kids?" And let's say you even found the woman that is on board with this, like you probably won't want her because she's not a supermodel. So
yeah, and
it's a lot of talking. It's a lot of yeah. I would have been a Greek warrior, in ancient times, but alas, I am like a laptop warrior. It's a lot of that. It's a lot of LARPing. It's a lot of projecting. But a lot of these people, and I often joke on Twitter, it's like never ask pronatalist how many kids they have because most of them have zero.
well, yeah, that's very very spot on. Yeah, it's I I've been kind of in pronatalist circles as well, and as someone who is a mother and a strange person in prenatal circles, there are a few. Like for example, the Collinses, they have children. They're really working on it. They're very committed, and I respect the grind. But yeah, I think to be honest, not to disparage them, but for men, it's a little bit easier to say, okay, I want this, I want that. The actual physical investment, the consequences was relatively minimal, both socially, culturally, financially, and everything else, physically
Right.
especially. It's quite easy to say. And I think there was a statistic going around that, this is the first generation where the men say they want more children than the women. I do think, like, in reality, I mean, most relationships that I know where people actually have children, want children, usually the women, I mean, marginally want more children than the men. Typically, like, the last child is vetoed by the husband because they're like,
That's
okay,
what I've
she's
seen as well. Yeah, I
yeah,
look, I think it's easy to say things, and especially today when everybody's got a platform, you can just say whatever. You can say you want 100 kids. You can say you want to rule a small island nation. You can say whatever you want, but at some point that you have to take active steps towards those stated goals, or you're just kind of a talking head.
yeah. And, it is possible to have a ton of kids. And in a way, I also see the point where it's like, okay, your ancestors, were like eating dirt with a spoon, and, they had 5,000 kids and all
Sure.
that. Absolutely, I agree to that. But the people that are talking about this online, they're just, yeah, very few of them, walk the walk. And I know even the Collinses who do this, professionally, this is their gig. They do actually make like sacrifices. I was talking to them, they turn off the heat in their house, even during the winter, and wear like puffy jackets to be able to afford this and that, and another round of IVF to do this. Like, they have essentially built themselves a cult that has a singular objective to propagate their lineage. And this is the type of like single-minded focus that you actually need to do that. And in a way, for them, it's actually okay, because even if they lose whatever heating in their house, they're not really losing status in the actual group that they've opted to, pursue status in. And like rationalist pronatalist group, it's, that
Sure.
sacrifice is seen like, oh, this is hardcore, these people are, committed to the end game. So maybe that could be a possible direction where people are like, okay, this is, you can mine status by being obsessive about your next IVF cycle or whatever, having children. So yeah, I'm not necessarily sure of the scales because they are a very peculiar family, but it is interesting to see. It's definitely a lot of flowers blooming at the moment in terms of pronatalism and all of this. Yeah, especially with new
Yeah.
tech, like that's
Yeah, and I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of kind of, the Mormons and other these kind of religions that are a little less mainstream doing all of the childbearing at the moment. There needs to be some sort of kind of transcendent principle that's kind of driving you to propagate as much as possible, because it's not going to come from modern society. So almost like a cult like termination is exactly what I think you need. And does that scale? I'm not sure.
yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, for me, I've also like had it in my mind that, okay, I want 4 children. Now we're probably gonna, hopefully have 3 if I can convince my husband, because we're at the point where it's like it's tough. It's really tough with
Yeah.
2 small boys. It's whew. So now, and that's kind of my project in the next few years to work on that one, that extra one. But you know, reality, you kind of have to take reality into consideration, friends, when you make your family planning decisions. It's quite an important aspect of it. But now to move on from pronatalism, there's one like observation that I've made, which is really, to me, it seemed interesting, and it's also interesting to me because I was also attracted to kind of men's rights at one point. I was really kind of involved. I went on some marches and all this type of stuff. Like, a lot of the big men's rights activists are women. Like, what exactly is the appeal here? I hope you enjoyed this shorter version of the Subversive podcast. For the full version, for the full archive, and for pretty much everything I've written in the last 3 years, please do head to the Substack link in the show notes, or to Patreon if you just want the audio version of the podcast. Thank you so much for your support. This is literally what keeps the lights on, the sparkly, twinkly lights that I got for the podcast, and puts food on the table of my children, multiple. So thank you so much for your kind support, and see you next time.